Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Fleeting Thoughts, an altered TCG podcast, part of the Maindeck podcast family. I'm Dan.
And I'm Jordan, and today we're going to be talking about something a little different. For the next handful of things, we're going to be diving deep into the lore of each of the factions. And assuming you guys enjoy yourselves at this cool lore dive deep, we'll hopefully keep it as a continuing series moving forward. But we wanted to at least start with just having an episode dedicated to each faction to kind of get some of the listeners that may not know the details of each faction and the story behind them and some of the characters that are in the game, and just because we think it'd be fun and it'd be interesting to talk about. So
I have up until now I've gotten little bits and pieces of the lore. When I was up in Paris, a couple of the devs sat down with me and dumped a ton of lore info on me, which was like, whoa, there's some wild stuff going on here. But Jordan, I don't know about you, but like prior to preparing for this episode, it was like I was just focused almost entirely on the gameplay. How about yourself?
I'm in a similar situation. Like there was outside of the big cliff notes of each faction, after I just heard like the quick elevator pitch of like Axiom are engineers and stuff, Ortis are like lawyers and pencil pushers and paper pushers, and Lyra's like artists and stuff. I was like, okay, that's cool. And then I never thought of it. And they're like, there'll be a bunch of lore on each card, and I was like, that'll be cool. I'm excited to dive into it. And then when I actually started reading of it for preparation for this, there's so much lore, it's sick. Like they could easily make like a novel probably for each character's like adventures and their extended adventures going forward, which I'm assuming they might have like in a pipeline somewhere later. Once the game catches on, they could like have like a Sierra and Oddball novel and their adventures past like how they started and then past the point that they have for the little lore blurb that they have now. But I could even I could see like if there was a movie about this land, just the little bit that I've read, I think it could easily be like a really interesting like series.
That was exactly my takeaway too. So first of all, we'll get into the actual subject in a little bit, but this episode we're going to talk about Axiom because I don't know if you mentioned that. We're talking about the Axiom faction specifically. So Jordan and I were reading basically every article we could find on the website that had information on Axiom and the heroes. And first of all, that was a lot. I was really surprised, but I was really pleasantly surprised by the writing quality. In general, is I'm not like a book a day reader. In fact, it's has been a long time since I really seriously read like a lot of books, but I have read quite a bit. I write pretty frequently, and I was just genuinely impressed with the quality of the writing in these stories, especially because this is coming from a French studio, and I was reading it all in English, and I just wasn't sure what to expect. Because we get games that do all sorts of different things from different studios, and sometimes you get a game that comes from Japan or something, and like I'm gonna point out Battle Spirit Saga. Like there was lore in that game, but it was it was insane. And the quality of the writing and the sort of like the character development and everything I got from these articles was like leagues beyond what I've seen in any like novel IP TCG in a long time, at least. I haven't read every single one, obviously, because like I said, lore's usually a second thought for me, but I do feel after this, I might make it more of a first thought for myself. I'm actually really pumped for the rest of these episodes now to really dig in.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Like, well, not exactly the same way. I'm not a big writer, but I definitely enjoy me good storytelling. And when I went into it, like you, most card games, like you get, maybe a couple sentences worth of backstory on characters, unless they're a major player in the card game. And it was, I mean, what I said in the beginning kind of sums it up. I could easily see whole novels being written about these characters and their adventures. The world seems really fleshed out. The characters have more than just a couple lines of backstory. it has almost an entire complete story within the little like snippet of lore we get, where there's a setup, there's some sort of conflict that helps the character kind of decide that they want to become an Exalt, and then the process of them fighting for it and becoming what they wanted to be. Like it's very cool. I like the way they did it. It's very enriching to the I was going to say lore, but to the universe of the game. And I think it's going to be, that makes it a lot more exciting, because I was worried when we started the series that there wouldn't be enough info and we were going to have to like peel into all of the like individual cards lore and try to like piece stuff together to have enough to talk about. But like, me and Dan read these stories and we're like, we probably won't even have time to even cover any of the individual cards. Like, just talking about the faction backstory and then the three main characters that have been released thus far backstory, we won't even be able to talk about like the locations very much. Like, there's tons of lore. It's going to be exciting to dive into. So
it's what they've built out here is actually frankly impressive. I'm very impressed. So let's we're going to dive into that in just a moment. So in this episode, you're going to get our Axiom kind of lore dump, thoughts on the stories we like, the characters that are we think are the coolest, that kind of stuff. And we're also, of course, going to be answering a few mailbag questions at the end. So make sure you stay tuned for that section as well, because that's where in all these upcoming episodes for the next 6 episodes, is going to be a lot of lore. And then we're going to hit those mailbag questions up and get some more kind of gameplay thoughts and everything based on the questions that you all ask. So before we dive deep into the lore of the machinists, the inventors, the Axiom, we're going to just take a quick moment to let you know, once again, if you do enjoy what we bring out to you here on Fleeting Thoughts and the other podcasts in the Main Deck podcast family, you can always support us in a couple of ways. Number one, all the engagement, like, comment, share, 5-star reviews on iTunes, Spotify, all that stuff helps us so much. So thank you all for everyone who is doing all of that stuff. And then if you are buying any cards for other TCGs, you can always do your shopping on tcgplayer.com using our affiliate link, which is bit.ly/shoptcgs. That's bit.ly/shoptcgs, or click the link in the description below and you can buy your cards there and get a little kickback sent to us, which is super, super helpful. So thank you all so much for your support. So Jordan, you picked this one first, I assume, because Axiom is still your favorite faction, right?
Gameplay wise, I think there might be a couple of those that are heading the competition, but actually it's a much more boring explanation to why I chose it.
Oh no.
I thought of either going like by my favorites, but I was like, nah, I don't want to like do favoritism that way. So I was like, maybe we'll do it by like color gradients. And I was like, nah, that's a little like more difficult. Okay. People could argue which one to be first. So I was like, I'll just do the boring way. We're going alphabetical, baby.
Alphabetical, baby. Now everybody knows exactly the order these are going to release in. And I'm sorry, Izmir fans, you're going to be waiting a while. Well, whatever. Alphabetical works. And you know what? Alphabetical is a logical way to lay things out, which is exactly the kind of way that an Axiom guild member would be laying things out. So let's start by talking a little bit about who the Axiom are. So I think everybody who plays the game or who has played the game has at least gotten the lowdown on the factions, understands the basics, which is, again, Axiom, machinists, engineers, researchers, inventors, scientists. They're typically people who are very pragmatic, very analytical, very interested in. I think the big thing is the Axiom are generally interested in creating inventions using the resources that are now available to them to create things to better, mankind in this age of rediscovery that we're in. Jordan, I would love in a moment to give you a second just to kind of break some of the info down for Axiom, but I want to mention, because this is going to be an important thing to do to kind of like set the stage, because if people know nothing about Altered's lore, there's like a full dictionary you need to understand everything that has happened in the world and is currently happening. So I think in this episode, I'm going to take a couple minutes and just go through kind of like this is going to be the really brief version of the history of the world to the point that they have reached now when we're actually like playing these characters in the game. So the confluence is the big event that happened in the past. Basically, the idea is that, so, and think in theory, in the altered world, we have the real world like 500 years ago, basically. And there was an event called the confluence. And when that happened in the world of altered, there's a veil separating the world of the imaginary, basically, and the world of reality. And in the confluence, everything just kind of smashed together in a big, crazy explosion, and it was horrible. And that was a big problem for everybody involved, effectively. So the fabric of reality tears open, and magic and mana and aether and everything is leaking out. Aether, which is the substance of what they call the Empyrean, which is the area of the imaginary separated again by this veil, spills out, transmutes everything, transforms everything, creates, you can just imagine a maelstrom of nonsense and difficult place to live, because if that stuff touches you, you're just going to turn into pebbles or feathers or whatever, right? And this was the age of the tumult then, and all of humanity that was there. I mean, it didn't go well overall, but there were tribes of nomads that kind of hunkered together, a whole bunch of tribes, and they survived. And they survived, and they didn't understand how to manipulate the world around them whatsoever, but they did know they were good old resilient humans. They knew how to try and hold on. And eventually they began to learn of areas called oases where the tumult was stable, and they could actually, put up a tent and not die immediately, which is great. That's the preferred way for humans to exist, typically speaking. So the nomads then kind of lived for a while, and eventually they started to move around, and a bunch of tribes, they kind of split up. There's a migration, and a bunch of tribes eventually all kind of got to this area, settled it, this kind of large oasis area, and we call that now Asgartha, which is sort of the main continent that's stable and a place where you could actually build a city, perhaps. And it's not 100% stable. There's still little like rifts that happen, but it's generally fine. And 500 years pass over this whole time, basically, and they develop Asgartha. We get to this point now where the human society within Asgartha has started to understand how to control the tumult. We have the people who have gotten used to the power of alteration, using this mana to do things like manifest eidolons, which are like, you can imagine something and there it is. And that's why we have historical characters, which in this world are like actually basically mythological, because society was lost. And so it's like, well, Ada Lovelace was a real person, but like she was as real as, I mean, to these people, she may be just as real as Loki was, right? It's like they're just stories. They're just characters from an ancient time that has been sort of lost to the confluence and the tumult afterwards. So now these people have learned how to harness this power, and are beginning to try and rediscover the lost continents and everything out from Asgartha, see what's happened to the world, and work together, hopefully, to get the world under control again. That's I think the briefest I can make it, while having, I think, like a decent explanation for everything. Did I miss anything, Jordan?
I think that's the main highlights. Yeah.
Okay.
From what I can remember,
there are details for sure. There may be things I may have adjusted the wording on uncharitably, or something, people are free to leave a comment down below. I did not mean to leave anything out, but go ahead and say, hey, you know what? That was great, but you just missed this one thing. That would be awesome for our listeners, so we can check anything that we missed. But now in this world of Isgartha, there are all these different factions where the people have sort of split into people with generally common goals, common ways of just kind of interacting with and perceiving the world. And as these factions, they are able to work together to start to kind of explore the world and put their own sort of influence. Together, they're able to stabilize the tumult in different places and kind of get their own society built up there, built around the things that they value. And that is where we have these sort of factions who are not killing each other, but just in a somewhat friendly competition with each other, just to explore and stabilize more of the unknown areas than the others. So, with that, the Axiom, Jordan, why don't you talk about who the Axiom are in this world?
Yes. So, the Axiom is a coalition of guilds, the way I understand it, of various craftsmen, engineers, academia, basically just scientists who want their overall goal is to use their knowledge to create things and devices that can help humanity as a whole. And they try their best to keep adherence to that, specifically the last part about if they're making something, they want to make sure that it's helpful to humanity and that no one gets special treatment from these benefits. Like they don't want to make like, oh, we like how here in America we have like, capitalism where highest dollar gets this thing. They wanted to make sure that everyone has access to these improvements at all times. So they make all kinds of crazy stuff. One of the things that they make that's similar to something we have in the real world, but just way cooler, called graphs. Graphs, think of them like prosthetics on steroids. A lot of Axiom people have them. Sometimes it's because they have a brush with tumult, and sometimes that disfigures parts of their body and it has to be amputated. Otherwise, it might spread throughout their body, potentially killing them or causing them to cease to exist. So amputations sadly happen probably a lot more than you'd think in the nice, shiny, happy world of Altered. But they have an easy fix for that, which are these graphs. These graphs come in, like I said, many forms. They have all kinds of features, and once they connect with you and you start to learn to use them, they function off of thought, which I thought was really cool. So after you acclimate to them, they essentially function just like your previous limb would have otherwise. Maybe in some cases with some better benefits, because I know there are some of the characters on the card characters, not the characters we'll be talking about today, where they have like not just like a regular hand, they have something that helps them do whatever they do best. Another important bit is Axiom loves Keylon, which is a new resource after the confluence happened, which creates an explosive amount of energy. Like, think they don't give a good metric here to like give a 1-for-1 to our actual world, but it sounds like it's like nuclear energy on steroids without the downside of nuclear energy of getting sick and dying and radiation and all that. So
there are even legends, in this world of the Axiom miners who are getting in there, like trying to pull up Keylon in all its various forms. It apparently comes in multiple different forms. It's fairly easy to store. It's like you said, very high energy, but there are legends that they may find forms of Keylon that would provide potentially endless energy. I don't know if that's true or not. But the interesting thing I think they mentioned about Keylon here too is that there's additionally a legend among the Axiom that speaks of the 4 primordiae, which are particular elements that could accomplish wonders. And they believe that Keylon is the primordia of fire. And then another rare element that Axiom is working on harnessing is called aerolith, and that is the primordia of air. There are still allegedly 2 more for water and earth, but they haven't yet been discovered. So there's a lot of potential room for this faction to kind of grow into an interesting story encompassing those two. I just like a quick aside, it's cool that they have these sort of like they have these sort of unfinished stories that are just where they can go from here too.
Yeah, I like it both from gameplay and lore, because lore, it gives more to explore. And then when I saw certain things, specifically like the Primordia, I was like, oh, bet you sometime there's going to be a set that's going to be, named after one of the new Primordia, and it's going to have a bunch of like wild effects. Like the Earth Primordia is going to add a bunch of like anchored or something to the Axiom like list, because it's going to be more like Earth powered kind of deal,
Oh
giving you
yeah,
that more anchored
they learn
center
to harness
feeling.
that in that
Or
like part of the
maybe
story.
tough, like it sticks around and gets stronger and stuff because it's harnessing that Earth power kind of deal, something like that. I could definitely see that having gameplay implications as well. But I agree with you. I like that they left some stuff open ended, so we have more to explore in the future. Leaves nice open ends to have stories later sprout from different sets.
Yeah, uh,
Um,
yeah,
I
for
also
sure.
and then so back to the guilds. This I actually got Star Wars vibes from, because the way the guilds kind of function is there's a hierarchy in each individual guild. So there'll be like a mining guild, or there'll be like a construct guild. They gave just a couple small examples, but they basically said there's a bunch of guilds, and then they have this um, I don't know if coalition is the right word. A council. That's the word. I knew it was the C word. They have a council which is created of masters from each of the guilds that come together, and they are the ones that kind of make big decisions for Axiom. And it reminded me, like I said, kind of like of Star Wars, where they have the Jedi
You think
Council,
of the
where
Jedi
there's
Council, yeah?
master. Yeah, so you'll rank up similar to like a craftsman job in our real life, where you start off as an apprentice. Then once you prove yourself, or in this case for them, in order to become a journeyman, you have to essentially create something, some sort of device that you pitch, and you're like, hey, this device fits this problem and it'll help humanity in such and such ways. And then the council will come together and be like, hey, we agree your device is worthy. And then they'll take that prototype and try to make it into a more widely used product, and that grants you the ability to become a journeyman. And then
It's a lot like writing a dissertation in the real world. Honestly, if you're going
yeah.
into any like academia, it's like you need to, well, do some interesting research, and then, then you'll have to like present it and defend it, and they'll be like, all right, yeah, like that was a useful contribution to our understanding of the world, and now we grant you the rank of, PhD or whatever.
Yeah, and I thought that was very interesting. So yeah, there's varying levels of mastery that you can attain in the factions and different guilds. And then one other big thing, or there's a couple other things, but one other big thing that they tend to make, as you'd expect if you've played the card game, you've seen them, is I was gonna say automatons, automata, which are creating autonomous, semi-autonomous, basically robots is what we'd call them in our day and age. But these ones function a little differently. They are powered generally by Keylon or some Tumult style forces. They can do a variety of things, and that combined with their ability to make constructs, which we can get into here in a second. The constructs are run a little differently than automata. Those are more like machines. The constructs are also powered by the the magical energy in Altered. They're made by Alterers by combining, I believe they called it runes. Basically, they're the way I understood it, it was like a power word that they engrave onto the construct, and it allows it to do some minor manipulations of
Hmm.
um, basically like an alterer would do. So it helps them keep more areas stable in a wider area, because the need for alterers are lessened, because they can create a construct to do some of the minor work for them in their stead, so they don't have to be on hand. Um,
Yeah, it's kind of like, just handing out a little minor bit of an alter's power to every, because not everybody in the world of alter, not everybody gets to be an alterer. It's not just like everybody is magical here. um some people are, and some people are not as attuned and not as capable of it, but the cool thing about Axiom is they're providing these tools to everybody to try and assist with that.
yeah, and with the constructs and the automata and graphs, these are what they encompass, called their alteration style. And this is basically how this specific faction, Axiom as a whole, uses their abilities. Each faction, I'm assuming, is going to have a different style, kind of like how they all have their different motifs. This is kind of like what they do, and it bleeds through into the gameplay. As most of the cards people have seen, they're focused on things like landmarks that are buildings, or some construct that does something for you every turn, or a lot of the characters are semi or just robots in general. So it kind of fits into that alteration style. So a lot of the effects are born from either a construct, a automata, or some form of graft that allows them to do stuff as they're adventuring through the tumult.
Another thing I think you see somewhat not infrequently, I guess, in some of the cards we've seen for Axiom are cards that have basically like a limited power to be used. They can be used like 3 times or whatever. You put Keylon counters on them and you tick out the counters. And that is, really directly calling on this idea in the Axiom lore where so the Axiom are constantly mining up this Keylon and Aerolith, as we've heard about a little bit as well. And they have to be constantly mining it because they're using it, like they're growing. Axiom is actually it's the most recent faction to be formed lore wise. The other factions kind of have existed a little longer, but Axiom just started to really coalesce together more recently than the other ones, and they've been growing and growing and growing. And as more and more of these inventors are joining the fold, and more of these guilds are forming and growing in their ranks, Keylon's getting used like a lot. Um, and the miners are actually quite worried about completely depleting their stock of Keylon, and they're starting to start thinking about the future. Like, okay, well, what happens if we run out of Keylon? What happens to the Axiom then? The Axiom would have to potentially downsize, would have to stop providing. Every single construct they provide has a Keylon core in it. How is Axiom going to be able to support all of humanity if they run out of Keylon sources? And I really like that there's a thematic kind of justification for having these cards that have like limited Keylon counters on them. It's sort of representing this. There's only so much to go around, and you're going to have to use what you have available. And then afterwards, well, then the thing is, you ran out of power. You have to figure out what else to do.
And that's actually brings me to one of the last points I have about the faction as a whole, which is dealing with that fact. They have forethought about the fact that some of this stuff is finite, and one of their big initiatives as far as what they want to do and what they almost mandate, if you're part of Axiom and you're doing work under them, is like recycling and reuse. I love that they have something like this in here, and it doesn't feel like it's forced in. Like, it makes sense from a lore perspective as well that they're big into recycling, because like you said, if they run out of resources, their stuff might stop working. They might not even have a faction one day if they burn up and burn out too quickly. So their forethought of being like, okay, how can we not only create a Keylon core, but how can we create one that can recharge over time? How can we recycle any materials? So like we were saying before, when you go on a trial to become a journeyman, if you get not discarded, if you get dejected, or what's a better word for that? Like you fail to do it. There's a specific academia word about like you didn't make it.
If you get rejected, are you trying to?
Maybe we'll just say, let's say your idea is rejected.
Okay.
What happens then is your work and the materials used for it will then be recycled, and the Keylon core is reclaimed and recharged to be used in other projects. And actually, they made a note saying, I can't remember if it was in the overall lore or in one of the characters, but they make great notes to reuse everything, including the like sigils and signs that are used on constructs. And they actually track them. So there'll be newer devices or constructs that are used that'll have pieces and parts that they can track back to when they were originally made, and like almost like each piece has like a history of like, this used to be on this and that through the years, and now it's on this device. And I think it's really cool that they have that both in the lore and, like you said, in the cards as well. There's a lot of effects that'll have, they'll tick down and then they'll lose all their Keylon power and they can't be used, and then they can be recharged by doing some action. Or there's a lot of things like the recycling center, which allows you to not necessarily recycle cards, but it lets you take cards and put it directly into your reserve, which is, something similar to like recycling, because you're not getting the new thing, but you're getting something that's just as usable.
Sure. I think the last thing I want to mention before we move on to our individual hero stories is just this. I really want to hit a little bit on Eidolons, and I think in each faction it'll be a good idea just to kind of mention the Eidolons that play a role in the storyline. So once again, Eidolons are a manifestation of a character of some kind. That character may be a real one or maybe a fake one. It doesn't matter whether it was someone legendary or someone who actually existed in the real world, because in the world of Altered, everything in the past is effectively myth and legend at this point. So through the power of alteration and through the free flowing aether and mana that's coming through from the tumult, any humans with this ability are able to manifest eidolons of all sorts of characters, and in the Axiom in particular, a huge part of the influence on a lot of the Axiom's initiatives come from eidolons such as Ada Lovelace, famed computer programmer from our real world, who has been playing a huge role in the development of the automata and all of all their robotics and their programming. Dr. Frankenstein shows up in the stories as well, who is also in part trying to develop these automata that are actually acting, as humans. And he has an experiment that he starts, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to infuse an eidolon within automata. So basically to try and give a corporeal form, a real form, to an imaginary eidolon, which is ethically curious as well. But it's an interesting, it's a very Dr. Frankenstein initiative, which I think is really cool. So those are two of the ones that I think are mentioned in here that certainly play a role, and you'll see their cards, I'm sure, in the game, if not in set one in the future. We know Ada Lovelace is for sure. We've already seen her card. So and I think each faction, we'll just talk a little bit about those too, because I think that gives you a good kind of grounding for what sort of characters to expect, along with all the various Axiom engineers and miners. You can expect characters like that who kind of fit within that, the general ideology of Axiom.
For sure.
So we've got 3 character stories. We got Sierra and Oddball, Treyst and Rossum, and Subhash and Marmo. Why don't we just start with Sierra and Oddball, Jordan? We can just go back and forth and tell little breakdowns of these stories and talk about them. Do you want to start with Sierra?
Yeah, sure. So Sierra, funny enough, she's born into a Lyra family, actually. Her father, I believe his name was, let me double check, Ephron?
Yes.
Ephron, yeah, that's what it is. For some reason I was like, it was Edgar, but no, it's Ephron. Her father, Ephron, actually ran a puppet show of sorts, and they'd travel around in a caravan. And to kind of shorten it, because it is a long story, what ends up happening is during one of these expeditions in between shows, they're traveling along, and the caravan kind of starts rumbling, and the caravan master basically yells to everyone, hey, you guys need to get up to higher ground, something's happening. And right under their caravan, a fissure opens up, a fissure of tumult just starts oozing out from under the caravan. A lot of their friends and compatriots didn't make it, but a large handful of them did end up making it out of the zone of terror, basically, because as they were running away, the tumult, doing what tumult does, is very volatile. It shifts and mutates everything and anything it touches in real time. It's not just like a simple, like acid or something. Like, it described some people turning into feathers and then blowing up into color, turning into the form of water. Like, basically just think of rolling a dice and random things happening at random moments.
Like 100-sided die.
Yeah, like 100-sided die. The way they described it was pretty wild. And they kind of break free, and they're walking away, kind of catching their breath. And Unfortunately, Sierra then gets a very sharp pain in her leg, and to her terror, she looks down and her foot had stepped into some tumult. This tumult then started causing, drastic mutations, which generated a lot of pain for her. She ends up passing out, but before she passes out, it does describe what happened to her leg, which sounds honestly horrifying. When I was reading it, I was like, whoa, this is a little dark. Where like her leg splits apart and then turns into pebbles, and then individual pebbles started morphing and mutating into like rock fixtures that had like feathers sprouting out of it, and a couple other like grotesque almost distinctions. And then she blacks out and she wakes back up, and to her horror, both of her legs had to be amputated because again they had some healers and some other things trying to stop the tumult, but they just couldn't. So they had to cut her legs off to make sure it didn't spread to the rest of her body and kill her. So she then, as she's recovering, trying to deal with the pain of losing her leg, especially being in Lyra and always being there to help her dad with the shows, she was bedridden and couldn't really help a whole lot. Things were looking pretty grim, and one day her dad tells her to get dressed, and Axiom has a World's Fair, think of it,
Yep.
where they just kind of have a big showcase of here's all the great new things that we've developed to help humanity. And while they were in the area to cheer his daughter up, he took her there, and she was delighted with everything that she saw. And one of the things that she was surprised with is getting some grafts for her legs, so she was then able to walk again. In addition to this, being so fascinated with all of the different mechanical trinkets doing different things, something that caught her eye was actually a small, think of like the little the like ballerina boxes that you open up and the ballerina kind of dances, except think way more elaborate. It was doing a dance, and she was fascinated by the precise movements it had, and she had grand ideas of being like, hey, I wonder if I could make something like this. It could really enhance my dad's puppet show. I could get these stage effects. And she started asking the gentleman who made the graphs for her if he could teach him something. So she started learning more and more. She went back basically every day while they were in the area, um, learning more and more about the different things, learning about Keylon, learning how to program, stuff like that. Um, so she started making these small additions to her father's show. But her father, of course, being a Lyra purist, he didn't have the heart to tell her he didn't like it because it was taking away from the artistic expression of the show, as more and more machines and devices were being used.
Smoke machines and stuff you can imagine. Like, yeah.
Yeah. But he loved his daughter, and he also just saw how good she was at it and started to see how quick she was learning it. And he came to the realization that there's a good chance that she's not going to follow in my footsteps, and she's going to make an excellent Axiom Guild member. So he approached the gentleman who made the graphs and asked, hey, would you be willing to sponsor her? He said, as long as she wants to with all her heart and soul, I will definitely take her under my wing and get her an apprenticeship. So they all had a chat together, and she thought about it. And I think the words they said too is, even though she thought about it the whole day, as they were walking back to the caravan, she kind of already knew that's where she belonged. So then that's when she joined Axiom. She quickly became a journeyman, and she built and came into contact with her chimera at the time, which is Oddball. And then they went through the initiation of what was it called again? Starts with an M?
The Musubi.
The Masubi, yes. And that is the ceremony where you basically become bonded in both essence and mind with your chimera. Chimera are the small, friendly beasts that are attached with each character. Normally out in the wild, they're just like living tumult. They need to constantly sap energy. They mutate all the time. But once they become stabilized and they get linked with another life force, they are able to remain in their stable form as their previous user, or not user, as their previous friend and link remembers them. So that is why Oddball and the other chimera attached to the characters never change anymore after they have gone through this ceremony.
Yeah.
And given her knack for stuff and her want for adventure, and I think it mentions her, maybe even her long dormant need to want to be nomadic like her family was with Lyra, traveling from place to place to do shows. She decided to enlist in the Expedition Corps and go on the frontier, go on the road basically, and explore the frontier. And that is where she is today.
Yeah, the Oddball in particular, I think they mentioned it in a different story somewhere, but Oddball was a drone, was just like a regular old machine drone that Sierra sent into like a rift that had opened up basically. And when it came back out, it was beeping and buzzing, and it was a little guy now. It became like it got mutated in there, became a chimera, and then she ended up bonding with it afterwards. So now that's why Oddball's got a drone with a cute little smile on his face, and um,
I'm
yeah,
glad you mentioned that because I didn't know about that. And I was like, in the story, I was like, I felt like the addition of him was very like rushed, and it was almost like a throwaway line. I was like, there's got to be more information on Oddball
yeah,
because he just like appeared in the story. Then they mentioned they bonded, and I was like, they didn't even tell me where Oddball came from. But if it was in another story, that makes so much more sense.
there are a bunch of stories here, and I definitely found it somewhere in there, and I don't think I can pinpoint where I read that again, but it's in there somewhere. It also mentions that she when she was a child, she in the Lyra, they're just telling stories to each other because the Lyra are bards and storytellers, and she heard about the legend of the City of Light.
Oh yeah, that's right.
The city of like pure gold is what they all like to think it is, and she, part of her motivation is that Lyra background, and she knows that there's this potential to find the City of Light, which is why she's like she wants to send the drones in. She wants to see like what's let's explore, let's try and find this thing. So that's something that really motivates her as well, which is kind of cool too.
Yeah, for sure.
So one thing I noted reading this story and all of them, and maybe if this was your first time hearing the story and you weren't aware, so Altered, I think Jordan alluded to this earlier. Altered really presents itself as a very like happy, friendly, like let's all hold hands and be friends.
Almost Disney-esque bad stuff doesn't exist in our universe kind of deal.
Yeah, but these stories, a couple of them, I mean, all of them really have some pretty um, dark moments in them that the heroes overcome. And so there's death, there's mutilation, dismemberment, all this kind of stuff happens, not in like a horrifying way, but in a realistic, like, yep, this is something that can happen in this world. Which I think really adds to the our ability to relate to it, where it's not just this like magical land where nothing can go wrong. It's no, stuff really does go wrong, but that's why all of this, everything has to be developed and created and overcome as well, because there are actual risks to everything.
Yeah, it definitely raises the stakes for like everything involved.
Yeah. So yeah, that's Sierra and Oddball's story, which is a great little story. I really like the sort of like cross faction element of it. Um, and Sierra, of course, now has Sierra's a character who has two grafted legs. Um, they're fairly simple ones because that was all her family could afford as Lyra nomads. So she has I think they call them racing blades, that are the grafts that she uses for mobility. Um, but now I think she's just used to them, and that's again, they respond to her thoughts. She understands them, so that's how she is, and I think that's really cool too, just to have that sort of like representation and everything too. I think that's a big thing you see in Axiom in particular is their ability to represent people who are differently abled, using graphs to and they choose to use them in different ways. Where Sierra has sort of like what we would imagine as a very high end, almost unreachable prosthesis right now, where it effectively is her legs again, but they're just made of metal, and blade shaped. Um, and on both of them, and she can walk around perfectly fine, which is just like this incredible thing. Whereas the next one we're going to talk about, Treyst and Rossum, he's content within his wheelchair, basically. I like that there's both ends of that too. There's the like people who are content with however they are, which I think that's the big message, to make sure you're hammering home with that kind of thing too, in my very privileged understanding of things. Um, So let's move ahead and talk to Treyst. Talk about Treyst and Rossum next as well. So I'll go ahead and briefly tell the Treyst and Rossum story. Treyst and Rossum, of course, is a character I really like. I have enjoyed playing their deck a lot. It's a very fun deck with some neat strategies to it. Treyst and Rossum is the story actually of. It starts as every very cheery story does, with two orphans. Who are Treyst and his friend. I'm gonna pull it up here. Paju and Treyst were two orphans who, I mean, at no point do we even learn anything about their parentage. This isn't a story of them finding out who their parents are. That's just they don't know who their parents are. That's the end of it. They are in an orphanage together, and they are neither the strongest or the most adept at alteration or the most creative or whatever. They're basically, they refer to them as two nobodies with big ambitions, and that's about that's about their skill set here. But ambition's what you need sometimes. That's the element that can get you to success. So these two dreamers are in the Kurung, which is the military barracks of the capital. After they've lived out their childhood as an orphanage, they basically they go where they can, which is the military barracks. And Paju, his friend, wanted to be a pilot. Treyst, his sight wasn't as good, so he wasn't able to be chosen as a pilot. But with the two of them in the military, eventually get to the point where Paju becomes a pilot and Treyst becomes a navigator, and they get to work together. Which is really awesome. And just being friends, Treyst ended up having the same kind of dreams of flying with Paju. So they get to join the Fulcrum, which is the factions branch that's dedicated to the Expeditionary Corps, and they have a horrible accident. Of course, they are on a topographic reconnaissance mission where they're flying above unknown areas when tentacles of what ends up being the Kraken, which is a Leviathan that is causing no end of trouble for the people of Altered constantly, reach up and basically knock the plane out of the sky, and it crashes. Where a few days later, Treyst awakens, no idea what's happened really, and discovers he is severely injured. His back is broken. He's also has a broken leg and a broken arm. He's covered in bruises and wounds, and Paju died in the crash. Just it's about as bad as he could imagine it could be. He's lost. He's bedridden. He's empty, and he has a construct that he uses to summon the Eidolon of Paju, who he remembers. Who can only stay around briefly because it's just a low power construct, but that's the only thing kind of keeping him going. He gets a graft to regain partial use of his limbs. And eventually he gets to focus on fabrication. This help of the construct and the grafts, he becomes interested in what the Axiom are doing. Joins, with the Axiom to start to make a name for himself, keeps summoning Paju's Eidolon to kind of keep him going, who just can't do much really, but smile and try and, keep his spirits up. Until eventually he learns of the manifestation of Frankenstein, who is attempting to put an Eidolon into an automaton. And Treyst finds this very interesting because he thinks, well, I can finally bring Paju back to life by making the Eidolon of Paju and putting him inside of a construct, which is like Full Metal Alchemist adjacent now, which is pretty wild for anyone who's familiar with that anime. So eventually Treyst gets everything together to start to do this, starts beginning experimentation with Frankenstein to try and create this, gets a basic automaton abandoned from Sierra's workshop, actually, of all things, and works with Ortus scholars, Izmir sorcerers, trying to fashion a machine that can do this. You can imagine Frankenstein pulling the lever and trying to electrocute the automaton, and does this, finally gives the experiment to go, begins to create a rift inside the lab, which is horrible. There's sounds and light and flashing, and everything could explode at any minute. So they abandon the experiment before the world tears apart. And Treyst realized that from that tumult singularity that's created, there is an automaton that came out of it, basically. Or not an automaton that came out of it, excuse me, but a some sort of a chimera came out of it and was actually put into the construct through their experiments. The experiment was a success, sort of. He didn't put Paju in the construct, but this chimera found itself suddenly inside the body of an automaton and was scared and had no idea what was going on. But Treyst suddenly found himself with this new purpose, because there was this being that was previously made of aether and stuff that is now inside this construct of his own doing. And Treyst considers it his responsibility now to help this being understand the world and eventually get back to his home, effectively within the, I don't know if it's within the Empyrean or something, but he wants to get Rossum is what he names him. He wants to get him back home. So Treyst, that becomes basically Treyst work, and he finally feels like he can move on without having to constantly have Paju by his side. He gets to indulge himself every day fully in the pursuit of assisting Rossum, and gets to see Rossum discovering the world as if, vicariously, really gets to live through him. Treyst is, every day has to insert Keylon cylinders into the graft on his spine just so that he can move about. But because of this pursuit he has now, he feels like he has a purpose that he's able to work towards. And that feels very fulfilling to him. So that's, so now he's going to join the Expeditionary Corps to, help get Rossum home, basically, is the idea. And I thought that story was really cool. I really liked the concepts in it.
Yeah, that was really wild.
It's kind of a dark story, and it's kind of an ethically unclear story about what's doing, because he really just ripped this creature out of the imaginary world and put him into a body, and then was like, well, I guess I have to take responsibility for you now.
Yeah. Whack.
Yeah, so so that's that one. And then we have the last set of heroes, Subhash and Marmo. Jordan, do you want to cover those?
Yeah, so Subhash and Marmo is probably the most grounded out of all of the ones that we read.
I agree.
It seems very the best thing I could think of is afterwards, I was like, Subhash is just kind of a hard-working average Joe that just kind of rose to the occasion in the end.
Yep.
So he was born in what is called what was it? It starts with S. It's like Subspira or Suspira.
Yep.
Yeah. So he was born in Suspira, which is the last peninsula to be stabilized, and I used air quotes there for people who didn't see me, because according to the locals, and the truth that the locals know, is it was never finished stabilization. It is extremely volatile there, and the main reason is they use Spira for exploitation, because it is extremely rich in extremely rare materials, including Keylon. So there's a lot of mining towns in Suspiria, and he was born into a family of 6. He was baby number 4. His mother works for a construction mining company, essentially. So they make the mines, and then they mine in the mines to get all kinds of stuff. And in addition to just being a mine shaft, working in a mine shaft in real life, really kind of one of the more dangerous jobs, not the best for your health. Think of it like that, except at any moment, in addition to like gas leaks and explosions, normal miner work, you could randomly hit something and cause a shift and break in reality where everything starts mutating around you and potentially killing you and everyone you know.
Yeah.
So
no problem.
Just regular stuff. So really high I want to say turnover job. But that's what his family is born into. He's used to long hours, a lot of work. Once he became old enough, he too joined the workforce and was in the mines. One day while he was in school, however, and I believe I don't think it was exactly stated if he was still in school when he was working in the mines as well, but when he went to school, he came across this puppy essentially that was a little bit messed up. The dog
A
had
little
its
bit.
legs broken. I think one of its legs was. Did it say if its leg was just completely cut off?
I think both of
Its
its
eyes.
back legs are mutilated, and its
Oh,
eyes
mutilated. That's what it was. Yeah, and its eyes were
are wrecked.
completely ripped out. Yeah, so
Yeah.
it can't see. He felt, really sad. He wanted to help this dog. He brought it home. His dad immediately was like, "Bring it in. Let's fix it." They nurtured it back to health, and they used uh, you know, their tech skills to make a little wheelchair for him, and it followed him around. He brought it to school. All the kids loved playing with it, and just to kind of put it into a picture of this dog being kind of like the light of not only his life but him and his friends and the school, because this was really harsh conditions because they lived so close to the mining and construction. It mentioned that like every day when he'd go to school, he'd have to wear basically like not quite a hazmat suit, but like a heavy suit with a welding mask because there's constant high wind and dust and like rock particles constantly like flying around in the air. So it makes it hard to breathe. It makes it not fun to walk in. So this dog really kind of lit up his life, gave him, a companion that was always by his side. He also was a little bit on the adventurous side. In their free time in between classes and work, they would like to go exploring. And one of the things that they like to explore is abandoned mine shafts. And that is actually where he originally found this injured puppy. So as he got older, he worked in the mine shafts. He just kind of, like I said, a hardworking guy. Him and his dog would go in the mine shafts. They'd get stuff done, go home, kind of repeat. And eventually he worked his way up. He wanted to work in the Bastion. I believe he also went to one of these larger world fairs and he caught wind of this gigantic city. And that's kind of when he started his apprenticeship, if I remember correctly.
He
And for those
he
who
he spent 8 years in the quarries, and that was the max they allowed you to for health reasons.
That's what it was. Yeah, he was no longer allowed to work in there because for health reasons. So he's like, well, I want to keep doing something similar. So he eventually applied and became employed by the Bastion. And the Bastion is, think of like this big citadel where there's a bunch. It reminded me when they described it, and based on some of the pictures, if you guys are familiar with Warhammer 40K, it reminded me of a Forge World, the way they described it, where there's
Okay.
all kinds of like tubes and bridges overhanging this big like mining pit where there's all this machinery working and gears are grinding. He said it was a cacophony of like gear grinding and pounding sounds and machinery at all times. But he was more interested in the deeper missions, the more risky missions where they delved deeper into the cliffside. And this is some of the area where they keep the Keylon hidden, like, or not hidden, but that's where they store it, where it's a little cooler away from the hot machinery. But while they were on a risky expedition, something, they're not exactly sure what, but the Keylon core at the base of this, basically this big, the thing that powers everything in the city. It's just this huge Keylon floating mass that's constantly being contained and siphoned energy, was starting to overheat, and they weren't sure what to do. So they sent basically everyone down there. Was like, hey, we have to figure out what's wrong. We need to try to fix it. Things were getting a little close, and they were going to call for everyone to just abandon ship. But our boy Subhash and Marmo were like, nah, we can do this. And Marmo started siphoning off some of the energy to buy them time. So Subhash and his workforce, basically, with that little bit of extra time, were able to get things under control and fix the core, bring its temperature down, and basically save the day. This was no small feat, and he started to get almost a little bit of a celebrity status, which then compounded when, after testing, when they're making sure everyone was okay, they found out that Marmo wasn't a regular puppy. And
It
in
turns out
fact,
it turns out not every dog can just siphon energy from the Axiom's
yeah.
Keylon core. So that was the first kind of suspicious thing.
Yeah. So after that, they were checked out, and it turns out Marmo is a chimera. And given his attachment to this chimera, and they've been basically bonded for, almost an entire decade at this point, maybe even longer, because it doesn't specify how long between when he started working at Bastion and when the Keylon Core incident happened. But it's been probably about a decade, if I had to guess. He's been hanging out with this chimera, and turns out being that close to a mutating tumult creature that has self-stabilized, it was in no shorter words. Basically, they did their own musubi uh, ceremony somehow. It never specifically stated how, but they were already bonded at this point. So everyone was urging him, and he didn't want to go at first, but everyone was like, yo, you need to join this expedition corps. You really should. You're perfect for it. Come on, dude. And he's like, I don't want to do that. I've really, not my thing. So he kind of fought it for a while, kind of denying the hero's call, if you will. And then one day he did decide to do it, partially because he remembered back to his family and his upbringing, and he was hoping that maybe by doing this, it would help basically stabilize his home area. He loves his home area, but once everything dries up, he wants to make sure everything gets stable there. And kind of joining this task force will expedite that process. He can basically play a first hand in that role. Along with, he just kind of started to like the open air. Growing up, always being in the caverns, always being in the mines, always working underground in this claustrophobic environment. I think at the end it said he really started to enjoy the open air and the open nature of being in the expedition force after he joined.
Yeah, it's his story is less tragic
Yeah.
than the other ones. Although I'm sure Marmo's state is anytime like a dog, dogs are not allowed to die in movies, for example, right? So this is thankfully Marmo was okay. So Marmo made it out and then saved the day. He was a good dog. He was a good boy. And so Subhash or Bash is his nickname. Bash and Marmo are the perfect character to get into if you want to play with the goodest boy, because that is exactly what Marmo is, the dog who saves the day.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are our three heroes in set one and Beyond the Gates for Axiom, and hopefully you guys found those stories interesting or intriguing. Maybe it made you a little more interested in a certain character, or made you want to dig in more to some of the lore. And maybe we completely botched the stories and we missed some important points, or we said the exact wrong thing, and that's totally cool. You can let us know in the comments down below where we screwed it up. We're really just doing our best here to try and relay the information to you all.
Yep. And like we said in the beginning, there's more here than we were expecting. So if we sounded a little, or specifically me, Dan sounded a little more structured, but I know I tended to jump around a little bit. In the future videos, I'll have that tampered down. I'll have a lot more grasp now that I know the breadth of the information that I need to be prepared to be ready for. I'll definitely be more eloquent in my storytelling in the future for you.
Yeah, did not give ourselves enough time to really prepare how to tell these stories to people, because there's so much to read. But I think that's going to cover our sort of our deep dive into Axiom for this one. So next week we'll be able to dig into Bravos, which should be exciting. I know Gavken already knows everything about Bravos, but he'll probably at least enjoy getting to listen to our takes on the Bravos heroes and stories and everything. Before we sign off for today, though, let's go through. We got we can do a couple quick mailbag questions for you all. Let's see. What should we answer today, Jordan? We have a lot of questions still left. A good amount here, but of course, we actually are gonna be start running out here in an episode or two. So if you have something you want us to answer on our mailbag, remember that you can go ahead and leave a comment on our YouTube video with hashtag mailbag in the comment, which lets me know that you want me to answer it in the video and not just not to reply to your comment with an answer or something. So that is always super helpful. Or you can always email it to maindeckgames@gmail.com and we'll add it to our list there. Today, we're going to answer two questions. We're going to finally get to A question from a longtime listener and a huge member of the community. Actually, just got one of the community spotlights recently. Eric Lazure. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say it Lazure or Lazure, and I'm sure he will listen and comment and let me know how I'm supposed to pronounce his name correctly. But Eric Laz is his name on Discord and everything. So Eric, thank you for sending this question a long time ago. We're going to finally answer it now. His question is, what will be your personal foiling strategy? Will you coordinate foilings with your community to have tons of physical foils? They confirm that you can play foils in tournaments even if you only own a non-foil version. So print on demand and sharing foils works. And I'm just going to quickly mention one thing before I have Jordan answer this. Give him a second to think about this too. We got a correction in our last podcast related to foils from Justin Parnell, the OP manager, who mentioned that unique foilers will apply to all uniques of that card name. Not you don't need a different foiler for each unique copy of the card. Jordan just got excited.
Oh, okay. Let's
So
go.
when it comes to your personal foiling strategy, if you acquire unique foilers and you want to use 3 different unique versions of Muna Druid or whatever, you just need 1 unique foiler to play that, to play all 3 of them, to print any of them, to print any of them in foil. So Jordan, what's your foiling strategy? How are you tackling? Are you going to be like trying to chase down a lot of foils? Or are you going to just, or do you want them foiled in your digital collection? Is that important to you?
For me, the more important one is going to be the in-hand feel. But I'm the type of person who likes to make sure it's going to be something I use a lot first. So given the freedom I have in Altered to basically choose which things I'm going to foil, I'll probably just bank all my foils until I finish making a deck or two that I know that I'm like, yo, this deck is sick. This is a deck I'm going to play a lot and build on into the future. And then I'll just start picking my favorite cards out of those, foiling them in order of cards I think look the coolest.
Sure. I think I actually have a unique answer to this one. I think I'm gonna, I have to play some more. I really like playing lots of different decks on Exalted online, but Muna has been still my favorite faction to play. And at the time of release, when we have the full card set, if I am still locked in on Muna, if Muna is still the faction that I really enjoy the most, which could change, but probably won't, then I may actually consider trying to unlock the full foil set digitally. That may be something that I like chase after. Because whatever faction I lock into is probably the one I'm really just I'm going to largely play when we have faction story events or whatever. I'm going to be aiming to be playing my favorite faction. I'm going to just keep calling it Muna because that's likely what it is, but I'll probably keep playing Muna for that. And I think it would be cool just to have the whole thing digitally unlocked in foil so that when I come up with a new deck build or whatever that I really like, I can always just go and, get my foils that I need. Do a little print on demand service to do that. Certainly I'm not opposed to getting foils from other people. But I think I'm going to really try and hone in on that faction for physical play. The nice thing is I'm going to have Exalted and I'll be able to play whatever I want all the time there. But which might be nice just for being able to, since foilers, in a lot of card games, the foilers you get are going to be like, well, okay, instead of getting foilers, you're getting I got a red foil, I got a blue foil, I got a black foil, I got 3 more green foils, and you get all sorts of things. Then it's like, okay, I got to trade to get my copies of cards I want. In in Altered, I can take all my foilers and just go, yep, green. They're all the green one, and I think I'm going to try to take advantage of that. I think.
Nice.
So yeah, that's our foiling strategy. And then next thing we're going to answer a question that's a little more recently. This is a question that was a comment on, I think it might have been a couple podcasts ago, but this is from Mr. Floppy LXIX9810, who asked, what do you think of uniques in conjunction with extensive card draw or even potentially tutors? So I think they're looking at Uniques are obviously more powerful than other cards. So is there potentially, Jordan, an issue with, a maybe disproportionate power level to card draw or tutors, given the fact that uniques exist? What do you think about that?
I want to say there is the potential there, but I feel like it's going to be more minimal than some other games. And the main reason being is the fact that your card is only going to be around outside of, whatever other effects you might have, for maybe a turn or two, depending on if it goes to reserve or not. Um, I could definitely see it being way less abusive than it could be in other games where that would have a system where you'd have 4 copies of the same unique, where you can tutor it and get it out easy and do stuff. But seeing as how you only need to remove it once to get it out of your hair, it's much more forgiving, even if they can get it on demand for that one time, especially given how many good removal cards there are in most factions in this game. Having one really good card isn't going to be the end of your game. It'll only affect hopefully that one turn, maybe the next. I could also see them easily having tutors. Instead of going to your hand, it goes to reserve, so you only have to deal with it that one time, and it might even be sabotageable before it hits the field. Um, but I can definitely see there might be some possibility. I won't say that there will be zero chance, but there is potentially a possibility of like a unique that just is crazy good if you can get it consistently right away, and then having a tutor that's cheap enough to just be like, "Yo, turn 2, it's coming, here it comes."
Yeah, I can see tutors being a little bit trickier to cost in this game. I think one thing that's kind of weird is that a lot of our play right now, I mean, all of our play right now, if you're trying to play altered at all right now, you are not using uniques. And players are getting very used to the non-unique game and deck building without uniques, and also deck building with this limited card pool. And I do think there's room for a deck that focuses on cantrip like effects to draw cards, things that just a cantrip in TCG being something that just replaces itself in some way, usually at a cheap cost, to effectively just try and like churn through your deck and find your unique cards. But I don't know if that's a winning strategy, because generally so far in the game, card draw stuff is costed to the point where you're not progressing that turn a lot of the time. It's pretty easy. If you're like you're playing Izmir, you drop a Baba Yaga and your opponent is playing Bravos, like you better have some removal or something, because you're not, the Baba Yaga base might as well have not existed. The Bravos is just going to outstat it without even trying. And as long as like there are exceptions. There's like Lyra, the croupier, who is a 0/5/5 for 4, which or for, I've just played this a million times. Is it 4 or 5? I totally blanked on it. I played this a million times and I can't remember. Anyway, whatever. It's got solid stats and has the potential to draw a card on a die roll. So like resupplies otherwise. Resupplying, the thing is, I think the most efficient card draw sources are really resupply sources right now. And when you are resupplying your unique, I mean, sure, it's good, but like you're only usually going to get it, that one time. Outside of there's probably some specific uniques that are like Athena uniques that are like, yeah, every time you play it from reserve, it loses fleeting and does some other nonsense. And like, okay, that could be good, right? So I think there's some room for like, I'm not going to close the door and say like, no, totally fine. But I do think things are going to be costed pretty well. And in Altered, you really just can't give up a lot of ground in the name of finding good cards, because the game is a race, and you have to, that unique better be able to totally regain control of the game for you. And as Jordan said, most of these uniques I think won't last more than a turn, right? Because they're naturally have to, because they then go to reserve, and then the opponent's going to be sabotaging them as quick as they possibly can.
Yeah. I agree completely. And yeah, I totally spaced the fact that taking that action is probably going to mean that you just gave up the turn to just set it up. So the unique would have to be good enough to where it would probably be way too overpowered to begin with. If getting it lets you basically make up a turn and win this turn at the same time. It'd be difficult to do.
Yeah, I think it's just, I think part of it really is that race factor of it, where there are some games where you can be I can take a turn to tutor because I'm just going to get a little damage back and whatever, I'll stabilize, it's no big deal. The farther you get behind in Altered, it's the harder it is to kind of claw back. And we see decks that can. Those decks are really fun to play, in my opinion. The Golrang and Toxin decks are like, that's so cool. It's like, yep, you're 6 steps ahead of me. That's fine. Everything I play is huge now. Good luck. And Croupier, by the way, Ouroboros Croupier is a 4-cost. I looked it up to make sure I didn't lie. And the out-of-faction one is an Axiom. Speaking of Axiom, which is like, that's kind of a cool card, because if there's like a cool unique Athena, that can either resupply it or draw it, and you're going to be happy either way. So, those are our 2 questions for the day. Once again, if you have any other questions for us, that things you want us to talk about in future episodes, we would welcome your mailbag questions. Feel free to leave them in the comments down below. Would love to also hear your comments on the lore deep dive. Did you enjoy this? Because we're planning on doing a lot more, so I hope you did. I really hope you liked this. I would love to know if it's terrible so that we don't do it. But we're planning on doing the other 5 factions, so definitely let us know what you think in the comments down below. Jordan, why don't you get our graft some jetpacks on us and get us out of here?
Well, as the day comes to a close, those were our fleeting thoughts. Thank you guys very much for watching, and we look forward to speaking with you again in 2 weeks. Goodbye.
Bye.